on
He's
that.
going to be talking about planning for an empowered birth experience.
Awesome.
So take it away.
Yeah, thanks. So I teach some of the childbirth education classes here, and I think that every mom needs like the basics, right? Like everyone, I feel like needs some basic information, foundational information before they have their babies, and unfortunately, they don't receive a lot of that information from their care team usually. Whether that's an OB practice or a midwife, like they just don't have that like time to sit there and explain sort of the birthing process. So I like to keep it simple, really, So number one, I think, is to help people really find the desire to relax into their labor, which is super helpful for letting the process unfold. They need to understand like what's happening inside their body in the first place, because I think that it really helps to have that understanding of like, why is this happening? Why is it good to have these intense surges, right? So walking them through that, and I'll just do some of that now. So basically, childbirth is broken down into 3 phases. So the first phase is really the labor phase. And inside that phase, or inside that stage, is 3 phases. So it's early labor, it's active labor, and then it's transition, right? So that all encompassing is like labor itself. And I think when we just hear labor, we don't hear about like all these individual sort of breakouts of labor. And I think that's really important, because what I find, especially for first timers, is that they're like, oh, I'm in labor, and then they go to the hospital, So helping people to understand like what are those phases and what to expect from each one. So for example, in early labor, that's really when things are really just getting started. And a lot of times people mistake like Braxton Hicks for early labor, and that's because it's manageable. So the good news is, for early labor, you can kind of be at home and do all the things that you would normally do, whether it be go for a walk, which is really great, eating, drinking, emptying your bladder. And a super important piece to this that I stress over and over again is rest. That's a huge part of early labor, because you're going to need that rest later. And in the next sort of phase, it's harder to rest. In addition to that, it's harder to rest once you're at the hospital, if that's where you're having your baby, right?
Yeah, I wish I would have known that, because as soon as I felt like I was like labor, and it's like, let's go. My husband was like, freaking out, let's go. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Everything just gets so hectic, and you don't realize that you could actually stay home and just relax for a little bit before you go to the hospital.
And even if it's, the middle of the day, just taking like a 30-minute nap, because you may not sleep, like if things pick up, you may not sleep that entire next night. Similarly, if you feel like your early labor is starting in the middle of the night, it's nighttime, right? So I always encourage my clients, like, if it's the middle of the night, pretend like be in the middle of the night, like go back to sleep.
Maybe the hospital's closed.
Right, exactly. Yeah, totally. Because again, like you may only get like a few hours of sleep, and if it kind of goes away and you sleep the rest of that night, like that's great for you for the next day. Because sometimes people, like, things start to pick up the next day or even the following night, because what we find is a lot of times, like, once the sun goes down, our bodies go into this like primal brain state where the labor starts up again, right? So getting in those naps whenever you can in early labor is so important. And we know that people get like really excited, or even like maybe their water breaks and they're like, oh, I'm in labor, I gotta go to the hospital. But I'm always like, try to rest, try to take a nap, like do those things you can do while you can still do them. And so nourishment, not as much. And we hear so much about like being active, and that is important, but we want to save being active for just that active labor. So that kind of brings us to the next phase, which is active labor. And that's when your labor starts to get into a really nice pattern. Things start to maybe pick up. You feel a big shift, right? So the contractions in early labor are much more manageable, and you don't really need to kind of focus on the breathing, getting through each one of them. You're able to kind of go about your thing and breathe naturally. Whereas in active labor, we see moms start to go inward, right? They really need to focus within, and they're having a little bit harder of a time, like maybe walking through them or breathing through them. And so they start to build that focus. And in active labor, we want to make sure it's sticking around. So that's when the question comes up, like, is it time to go to the hospital? What I always say is like, let's just make sure it's sticking around in active labor, right? Because we want it to get into this real nice active pattern that isn't going to go away the second we step into this like bright facility that's sterile, in an environment that may not be like, you know, that supportive of this like instinctual birthing process that we need for our bodies to open up and unfold and let labor do its thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, in early labor, are you dilated at all?
So early labor is usually like when you're going from either 0 or whatever kind of you started at. Like some people, we see that people, you know, are dilated a little bit before labor even begins, which is great. But your cervix is starting to soften and open up to around like 4 to 5 centimeters. And then the active labor is when we see it, your cervix is opening from like 5 to 7, around 7 centimeters. So that's what they're measuring when they do the, you know, the internal exams to kind of see how soft is your cervix, how much is it opening, where is the baby's head in relation to your pelvis. So looking for that station is what they call it, to see, you know, where is the baby, is there optimal pressure on the cervix so that when we have these contractions, they're actually making progress. But again, like I think people also have this like need to go get checked, right? They kind of want to know, where am I at? Right?
100%, yeah. And I'm sure people Google things and it's like, go to the hospital.
Right. Is like, if you suspect you're in labor, go to the hospital. And you know, I think it makes so much sense. Like even myself, when I was in labor, I was like so curious. I'm like, I just want to know where I'm at. I've been doing this for 12 hours. Like, where am I? You know? But it seems like a lot of times people get like stuck there. Like for some reason you have to stay, you know? So I always encourage my clients, try to labor at home as long as you can. But ultimately the birthing person is the one who decides when to go. So there are a couple things, like we want to look for that nice labor pattern. You know, and of course there may be other like indicators that you may need to go to the hospital for. So for example, if excessive bleeding, like if you have excessive bleeding, like some bleeding is normal during labor, because we see like as the cervix softens and opens, some of that bleeding is normal, like that mucousy blood, right? But if you feel like it's heavy bleeding, then I would say go to the hospital. In addition to that, if your water is released, right? So if you're more commonly known as like your water breaks and it's tinted like a green color, that would be a sign to go get checked out at the hospital, because that could mean that the baby had a bowel movement in utero, and that could be a sign of distress. So just a couple things to look out for, aside from that like real nice pattern combined with mom's intuition saying like, it's time to go. I feel like I need to go, because when we think about it, some people may not be feeling safe laboring at home. So that's kind of counterproductive too.
Right. When does usually the water break? Like in which stage? Yeah, when somebody had a question about this.
Yeah. So it really doesn't, it varies from person to person. Some people's water doesn't break at all. So either the provider breaks it for them with a little tool, or they just let them have the baby we call it in call, right? So it's like the baby's born in the center. So it really varies from person to person. Sometimes the water breaks before labor starts.
Right.
And they're not even in labor. It's just their water breaks, and that's kind of the first sign that they want to try to get things going. But it doesn't really match up to any sort of stage of labor.
Right. And it's not always like a whoosh that you see in movies, right? It's just like it could trickle out, or it could just come out a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people mistake, right? They're like, I don't know if my water broke. And like I always say, the easiest way to know is if you feel like your water broke and it's just like a little bit of a trickle and you're not really sure, go empty your bladder. Go empty your bladder, make sure that that's empty, because if it is, like if your water has broken, it will continuously drip. So if your bladder is empty and you feel another, like even if it's like a minor gush or a little trickle that continues, it's probably that your water has released, and it may be like a high break, and that's why the trickle.
Okay.
Someone just asked if it smells. No, typically not, and that would be something to kind of look out for. But amniotic fluid shouldn't smell, like at least healthy amniotic fluid.
Okay, thank you.
And then moving on to, the transitional phase of labor, right? So this is when we've gotten through the active labor phase, our cervix has now softened almost completely. So we're looking at a percentage in the softening. So when you start labor, you can be anywhere from 0% effaced to, you know, some people start labor at 50% effaced. And then by transition, you should be 100% effaced. Your cervix is nice and thin and now completely ready to open up for that baby. So that's when you're really going from 7 to 10 centimeters dilated, and the baby has now enough room to start passing through the birth canal. And transition can be the most intense phase of labor for most people, but the good news is it's also the shortest phase. But this is when people start to feel like feelings of self-doubt. It can be really scary because you're about to push this baby out and this surge of hormones. And we also go into this like expulsion mode. So it's very common for people to vomit when they're in transition. They also have that like hormone surge. So some people shake. It is kind of an intense phase.
Yep.
So one tip for that would be like just to stay as active as possible. So changing positions can be really helpful in this phase. And then really just relying heavily on the support team and making sure that the support team and, you know, a doula and your partner and a good care team will know that a birthing person really kind of needs to go into this like primal zone. Right. So you see people really start to turn inward and tap into some of those primal noises. So, and when we say noise, I think we think about maybe people screaming in labor, but that's not productive and it's not helpful. It's also not primal. That's more like a fear-based noise. And so I always encourage my clients to use those like low, slow vowel sounds like oh, those things can help us stay soft and relax and let things kind of unfold.
Do you have any tips for making the environment just a little bit more calmer, like a certain type of music